So I'm just reading whatever that is
Okay. All right.
on
So
it lah.
let's do that again. Start again.
Okay.
Yeah. So your title. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So you have pressed the recording button?
Yes, I have.
Okay, all right. Okay, just checking. Okay, all right. So identity in the periphery, consequences of nationhood in KS Maniam's The Return. I'm also thinking whether or not I may change it like tomorrow or the next day after tomorrow. Consequences on nationhood. But that is, like, I think as I discover more, I'll decide lah. So this is the overview. So firstly, I will very briefly explain the state of Malaysian literature in English. And then I will also talk about identity in the periphery in MLE, and then consequences of this peripheral identity to nationhood, on nationhood, sorry, as can be seen in one text, the corpus KS Maniam's The Return. And then I believe there are four consequences that scholars have discussed. Number one, it's internal exile, and then incomplete sense of identity. Thirdly, existentialist crisis, and then alienation and isolation. So I believe that these four factors uh, are caused by the identities of the characters, and then vis-a-vis perhaps the authors being in the periphery. All right, and then after that, I'm gonna be hopefully I'll string things together by discussing the ongoing pursuit of nationhood in Malaysian literature, and then I'm gonna conclude the presentation. Okay, so the first one is the state of Malaysian literature in English. So what I know, so these are the critically acclaimed writers. So actually, Malaysian literature in English was deemed to be so flourishing. I think during the colonial years leading up to independence and then during the 1960s lah. However, since then, this scholar right here deemed that the growth has been slow. Why is that? Because of this language policy and the uncompromising notion of what constitutes its national literature, and that means the forefronting of Malay literature as the central, and then the English lit or Malaysian English lit considered to be in the sectional lah. And then because of that, the primary interest of the MLE writers seems to be nationalism and nation formation, basically discussing how does a nation look like in Malaysia. All right, and then in another work by Eddie Tay, so this is a book published in Hong Kong first and then Singapore. So here he actually cited Shirley Lim, who mentioned in her memoir that because of the May 13 riots, that basically triggered this whole change in policy and change in language and literature policy. So from Malaysia being this ideal of a multicultural egalitarian future, it became this Malay dominant race preferential practice in place today. So because of that, a lot of the writers or a lot of people felt that they couldn't really question Malay hegemony. So that is the argument of this book lah. The policies basically centralize only one language, perhaps indirectly or inevitably to the detriment of the other. Okay, so because of that, Malaysian literature in English has been placed some sort in the periphery because it is no longer central or no longer being prioritized. All right. So yes, the same book, but this is another chapter. So I may actually include the chapter in the citation as well. So this is the idea of marginalization in MLE. So the writer argues that KS, like for example, the Anglophone writers, they were very conscious of their marginal status. And also in Maniam's novels, he found that Maniam managed to invoke the condition of a diaspora to testify that one is not at home within the socio-political space of the nation, and hence to reconsider issues of identity and representation. And then this is another paper on Lloyd Fernando's Scorpion Orchid. So this is by Bernard Wilson. So in this paper, they discuss a sense of self and other. So basically, when being placed in the periphery, how is identity and nation being perceived lah? So in discussing the characters, the author here stated that in doing so, the former binary division between colonizer and the colonized is replaced by a racial sense of self and other. So this is when after independence, and due to the centralization of a majority race or majority language, now the binary is no longer between the colonizer and the colonized, it is between that self and the other. So who is becoming the other? All right. Okay. And then Fernando also, so in the paper argues that Fernando shows there is no PEP solution to the issue. Okay, so this is the consequences of nationhood on identity, as seen in KS Maniam's The Return lah. So yeah, so number one is internal exile. So for this one, being not at the central or being not of a priority in a nation caused the characters in the return to feel this internal exile and a desire for belonging. So this is because there is this blood division between individual and national consciousness. I think personally, if one is a citizen of a country, one would love to locate themselves within the community and within that national picture. Uh, yeah. And then the second one is incomplete sense of identity. So this one I applied your paper, Dr. Rai. And then this one, it's basically the reification, because Ravi's fluctuating, existing between the worlds of his past and present, his identity has yet to reach completion. Because, like you mentioned in the paper, his past, his community experienced this huge symbolization, and then he couldn't really detach himself and land on solid ground on either worlds that he considered himself to belong to. So because of that, I think until the end of the novel, it has been argued that his sense of identity was never complete and may not ever be complete. But that is the struggle of existing in the periphery. You are never the center of, and on any ground. And this is a very interesting paper on existentialist crisis. So it doesn't really discuss nationhood, but I believe that the crisis of existentialism discussed here is a result of the characters being in the periphery of society lah. So existentialism is defined as a situation that lacks meaning, and then humans in such situations will attempt to create a life that is substantive. And we can see this in Pariatai, in the father, basically, all of most of the characters in the return lah. Okay, and then the last one is alienation and isolation. So this one also you and Prof. Rosie wrote it with this Zadeh.
PhD student, yeah.
PhD, yeah, yeah. All right. Okay. Alienation and isolation, it is related to the struggle of living in an immigrant society and its relationship with racism and multi-ethnic landscape in Malaysia. So they are living in a homogeneous community at that time because it was the estate, but in a nation that treats them as marginal. So within the community, they are, center, but in a larger scheme of things, they are very much marginal lah. So because of that, right? So much negative connotations into the impacts of nationhood. Uh, so yeah, so where do we go from here lah? So this is the ongoing pursuit of nationhood. So in this article, Gabriel basically argues that the issue of identity and nationhood are not of a permanent nature, but discursively constituted. All right. So the writings of K.S. Maniam. So in studying K.S. Maniam, she deems that he managed to resist and challenge the manners of state imposition of national and ethnic identities, because in Malaysia, the ideas of nationhood are, oh, how can I say this, are deemed state sponsored. However, Maniam in his novels managed to challenge and counter that state imposed narratives lah. So that is very important.
Through his author-defined social reality.
Yes, through his defined social reality, and then this book again, but in another chapter. So he mentioned symbiosis between center and the periphery. Just because something is of the peripheral nature, it does not mean that it is not central to our understanding about nationhood lah. So because this is the practice of post-colonial writers, basically the center informs the periphery as much as the periphery informs the center. So he believes that there is actually this symbiotic relationship in terms of how nationhood can be looked at. All right. So the conclusion that I've come up with very briefly just now is that MLE serves as a platform on which the discourse of identity and nationhood can be explored in an in-depth manner. Nationhood is an ongoing process and constantly evolving. There have been bouts of fluctuations, never landing on solid ground. As a result, individual consciousness, which is tied to the consciousness of the nation, also experiences tremendous amount of change in seeking a sense of belonging and connection. Such is the impact of colonialism and British policies on Malaysian society, and consequently the individuals living in it. Right. So that's what I have for now, Doctor.
Okay. All right. Now, if you reflect on the paper that we're working on the motherhood,
Yeah.
this assignment is basically asking you not to write the full paper, but to write the literature review section of the entire paper.
Hmm.
So if you look at your title, if the entire paper is about identity in the periphery, consequences of nationhood in Maniam's The Return, if that is the entire paper,
Oh.
what would the literature review section be about? So
Hmm.
it ought to be about peripheral identity in Maniam's The Return, or it could be peripheral identity in MLE and in Maniam's narratives.
Hmm.
So you don't want to bring in nationhood at this juncture. For the literature
Okay.
review, you don't want to bring in nationhood. That is for the full paper, right?
Hmm.
So if you're writing a full paper, the issue of nationhood will be part of the methodology of how you examine the text using key concepts from studies of nationhood, um, uh, othering and marginalization of identities, rarefication of identities, and all the rest of that.
Okay.
Right. So for this assignment, all you need to do is focus on the literature review component of the full paper. So imagine you were writing the full paper on this topic. The literature review will only need to showcase previous studies on this topic and evident gaps in the previous studies. So I like very much how you've identified four key themes. You've conceptualized four key themes
Hmm.
based on previous studies. I like that. That's a plus point. So what this assignment should be about is asking the question, how do I prepare this paper, the literature review section on this paper, in order to answer the topic, in order to address the big topic of identity in the periphery, consequences of nationhood, and Maniam's The Return. So first thing to do is, what is the section on literature review called? What would the section be called? Will it be called peripheral identity in MLE? Will it be called peripheral identity in Maniam's The Return? Will it be called peripheral identities in Maniam's narratives?
Hmm.
So that will indicate which scholars do you need to bring in.
Okay.
Okay? Hence, I've given you a minimum 5 journal articles to bring in. Because the assignment is basically training the students to write a focused literature review section of a journal paper. In
Hmm.
order to write the literature review for the journal paper, you need to know exactly what the topic is and the scope of your study is. So you don't want to broaden it to Malaysian literature and English because you already know the particular writer you want to review on. So that being the case, the section should be on peripheral writings in Maniam's narratives,
Hmm.
right? So that way you get to bring in as many scholars as you see fit on this topic. And the beauty is you have presented it or organized it in a way that shows you know the themes you want to identify. So the next question to ask is, how will you organize this literature review section? You've decided on the themes. So that's brilliant. So that means after the first slide on what is this presentation about, second slide will be internal exile. then
Ah,
followed by incomplete sense of identity. And then the next slide will be on existential crisis. And then the next slide will be alienation and isolation, and then conclusion.
hmm.
Because you are only writing the literature review section of your final project if this was going to be a topic. So you go back to the journal paper that we're working on, the literature review section is like maybe 2 pages,
Yeah.
right? So in order to write the 2 pages and create an impactful reading of previous studies, you need to have this approach.
Hmm.
So slide 1 is the introduction to the presentation, plus the thesis statement. What is this presentation about? Slide 2 would be on internal exile. Slide 3 would be incomplete sense of identity. Slide 4, existential crisis. Slide 5, alienation and isolation. And then slide 6, conclusion. Done.
Okay.
So
Okay.
when you are talking about internal exile, you may bring in Qayyum, you may bring in Gabriel, you may bring in myself, you may bring in Rubabe's paper. You may bring in any other papers for that matter. The minimum 5 is just as a kind of a guide to ensure that the students read extensively rather than rely it only on one journal article. Okay, what is important is the exercise that you have developed, which is the ability to conceptualize the patterns that is emerging based on the topic that you have identified. That is the more important learning outcome. And I think you've got it here.
All right. Thank
So
you so much.
simplify the title, focusing only on the literature review section of your entire paper, so to speak. If this is a paper you're working on, yeah.
Yes.
So that way, you may, at the end of the semester, you may say, week 10, you may say, you know what, I don't want to work on Maniam's narratives. I want to work on maybe Tash Ao's narrative.
Hmm.
Then I'm going to look at this literature review and ask myself, does Tash Ao's narrative also problematizes peripheral identity in the same way?
Hmm.
If it did, you just need to kind of find supporting references. Or you can say, the literature review will be looking at Malaysian literature in English generally, for the literature review section, looking at internal exile, incomplete sense of identity, existential crisis, alienation and isolation. But the corpus that you will focus on will be on Tesh Au or on Tan Tuan Eng or Prita
Hmm.
Samarasan or Rani Manika or any other Malaysian writers, or even on Adiba Amin or any other Malaysian writers. So this component of the literature review, you may rework it slightly for your final project if you are still interested on the theme of peripheral identity in
Yeah.
Malaysian writings.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
So I just go straight at it. Wow, I'm so
Yeah.
surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's a review paper, which
Hmm.
means all you need to do is review those papers, but you are not reviewing it by saying Qayyum 2008 said this and this and this. Raihana et al. Said this and this and this. That's not a review paper. That is a bibliography, a summary of a bibliography,
Hmm.
annotated bibliography, they call it. What you are doing is to say, I have read extensively, and based on my readings, these are the patterns that are emerging. And the patterns emerging illustrate these themes, which means this section of your assignment can be prepared into a review paper and sent out for publication.
Okay.
Just that part, because you have identified original themes. These 4 themes, these are original themes. As you explore further, you may read up a few more articles and you may find there are like 2 more key themes on peripheral identity vis-a-vis both Maniam's narratives as well as Malaysian writings generally.
Hmm.
For instance, gender.
Yeah.
Is peripheral identity taking into consideration gender or religious sense of identity, or is that incorporated into this internal strife and incomplete sense of self that appears in these 4 themes? So but these four are quite good and comprehensive. So I would say keep it as it is, but simplify your presentation to only focusing on Maniam's narratives, or
Yes.
even Maniam's selected narratives. So if you want to kind of further narrow the scope, so identity in the periphery, a review into Maniam's selected narrative. Keeping in mind you're doing a review, so your title should not be an actual research title.
Okay.
So your title should be identity in the peripheries, a review of Maniam's selected narrative, something like that. So
So
that,
if sorry, doctor, if I focus on the return only, is that acceptable?
that's fine, as long as the 5 articles that you have focused on are discussing the return.
All right.
So identity in the periphery, colon, a review of Maniam's The Return.
Okay. Okay. All right, doctor.
The Return. You've
The review. So sorry.
no, yeah, okay, yeah,
Okay, all right.
yeah. So that this title, if this was a full paper, this is the title of your literature review section.
Yes.
This is not the title of your full paper. This is the title of your literature review section, right? So the actual paper may be about peripheral identity and nationhood. That just now, that nationhood part, that could be the full paper,
Yes.
right? So the component of nationhood will come later in the paper.
Okay, all right. However, if the paper itself, within these 4 themes mention nationhood, it's okay to mention it.
That's fine.
Just don't discuss it.
That's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. Because you are conceptualizing the discussion of nationhood within one of these themes.
Yeah.
That's what makes this type of a literature review original and publishable. Because you're not just mentioning what certain person says, you are conceptualizing it and presenting an original take on past studies.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Then I have, because I was worried, oh my God, this is going to be too long. So now at least I have a very focused.
I'm thinking 6-7 slides max.
Yes. Oh, 6-7 slides. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Doctor.
But each slide, you may have like a minute or 2 minutes to say something about it. But the slide, the content, it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be wordy. You may prepare your script and you may show us certain quotes or whatever. But yeah, I'm looking at 6 or 7 slides and maybe spend between 1 to 2 minutes per slide. That makes it 10 to 15 minutes. How many minutes did I ask you all to do? I forget.
10 to 15, I think.
Yeah.
But yes, all right. Okay,
Yeah.
doctor, this
Okay.
is great, to be honest. It really saves me a lot of trouble, because I was thinking it is a little bit too wide for me to be discussing nationhood as well. But I guess when one gets excited about discussing, they want to discuss everything.
No,
All right.
like I said, if this was a full paper, nationhood will be the methodology. It will come up, but it will be the methodology, not the review of literature.
Okay, so nationhood can be methodology, just in case if I want to work on this in the future.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, thank you so much, doctor.
Welcome.
I'll see you Monday then.